We talk about the 4-H thriving model through the equity lens. And it is my pleasure to introduce to everyone Dr. Nia Imani Fields and Dr. Faye Moncloa. Um, Dr. Fields is the Maryland 4-H program leader and assistant director of Maryland Extension. And Dr. Moncloa is the 4-H Youth Development Advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension in Santa Clara County. Also, they are both the co-chairs for the Access, Equity, and Belonging Committee, which is a Program Leaders Working Group committee. So without further ado, I will turn it over to these wonderful women to talk about our topic for this session.
Thank you so much, Philip. I do want to have a disclaimer. We have a horrible thunderstorm going on right now where I am in Baltimore, and my power is playing tricks on me right now. So if for some reason I get disconnected, I will hop on via my phone, and my trusted co-host here might fill in the gap while I reconnect if that happens. But Faye, did you want to share any remarks before we dive in?
I just wanted to say hello and welcome, and I'm going to put the link to our committee in the chat in a few seconds in case you haven't heard about us.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so we can go ahead and advance the slides. All right, so starting us off on the same ground as far as the term social justice and equity, because that's kind of grounding our work this afternoon, resonates with me. And it's one that I'd like to start with. And I think there might be some language missing from the top there. There we go. Okay, so youth development professionals play an integral role in the positive outcomes of youth and communities, right? And we have to remind ourselves that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So this work and our role in the space of youth development and social justice and equity is paramount, and it's actually our responsibility as youth development professionals to be familiarized with the notion of social justice and injustice and what that means in our communities and what our response needs to be both within our programs and within the community at large. So on the next slide, this speaks a little bit more about our responsibility to employ culturally relevant practices in extension, to identify and engage the perspectives of communities in the design, implementation, and evaluation of programs. And then third, to acknowledge that to remain indifferent to injustice is actually a form of contributing to injustice itself. So, we can't ignore or not react and respond to the injustice and inequities that we have within our own programs and practices, as well as the society around us. So we have to be familiar with them in order to respond appropriately. So on the next slide, here's a quote from the ECOP 4-H group. For those of you who are not familiar, we have an extension organization on policy, and there's the 4-H subgroup that's a part of that. And they've recently been charged with drafting an equity strategic plan for 4-H. And this is a statement that comes from that. So I'm not going to read the entire thing to you, but I want to point out that it charges us and it calls us to be responsive to the disparities that exist within our communities that's leading to an opportunity gap or has led to an opportunity gap. And that we need to make bigger strides in 4-H to close the opportunity gap and support the well-being and economic mobility of youth. And overall, with the goal to reach 10 million youth that reflect the diversity of our communities by 2027. And this refers to our youth, as well as our volunteers, our faculty, and our staff. And of course, our SciFi programs are one of the ways in which we have been doing this within Extension. So on the next slide, it goes a little bit goes into our committee. The Access, Equity, and Belonging Committee was launched several years ago, at that time by NIFA, and it was called the Vulnerable Populations Task Force. We have since changed leadership, and that we are now under the Program Leaders Working Group, and the name to be more asset-based. So our team focuses on providing professional development and resources to our 4-H professionals and indirectly to volunteers in order for us together to strengthen our capacity to engage and sustain participation of diverse youth in 4-H. And we serve as the coordinating body among several national efforts. So we have a SciFi representative with our group. We have E-Extension, we have our National 4-H Professional Association, and other affinity groups that are working together with us so that we can have comprehensive plans and approaches to our equity goal. Next slide. This shows you the groups, the champion groups that we have within Access, Equity, and Belonging Committee. And these are identified as being unserved or underserved, either by 4-H or at large in society. And each of these groups have either co-chairs or chairs that are moving us along in our mission and vision to better engage with intention and equity these audiences that have been underserved or unserved by 4-H historically. If you're interested in learning more about either of these champion groups, I encourage you to check out the link that Faye put in the chat for us. Several of these groups are still recruiting new members. So if you're interested in learning more about what they're up to and what resources we have available, please check out the website. So to move us forward, let's kind of ground ourselves in a common understanding of key terms. You know, there's been an uptick over the last few years around terminology related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we want to be sure that we are all on the same page when we use these terms within 4-H. So nationally, we are adopting these terms as far as our national work related to equity. And I want us to get on the same page today before we move too much further. So on the next slide, you'll see kind of a snapshot of some of the key terms I'll point out today. And I will share that on the E-Extension website. If you click on that link that's on the, or if you see the link that's on the bottom of this slide, campus.extension.org, if you search this title, Increasing Cultural Awareness and Equity and Extension Programs, you'll find 3 free modules that are accessible to anyone, so long as you have an E-Extension profile or create one. And the first 2 focus on self-reflection and grounding ourselves in the terminology and philosophies of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the third one is geared primarily towards volunteers to ground themselves in culturally relevant practices. And so in the first module, we dive deeper into these terms. And I want us to focus for our purposes today, because we have a condensed time, on some of these key terms. So on the next slide, we have equity and equality. And too often these terms are used interchangeably, right? But there's a difference and a distinction between the two. Equality refers to each member of a society or group receiving the same resource or treatment regardless of what may be needed to achieve a desired outcome. Versus equity is when a group receives or a person receives unique resources and opportunities needed to reduce or eliminate barriers. So on the next slide, we have an image of 3 pictures. I'm sure you all have seen something like this over your time in 4-H and working in this space. And I should have asked Susan, I'm not sure, are folks able to unmute and speak?
Yes, they are.
Perfect. So if someone is willing to unmute and tell me what they see the difference is between these 3 pictures, and if you've seen a similar model, what might be significantly different in this version compared to others you may have seen? Or you can also use the chat if you're more comfortable. Surely there's someone who has a thought.
I can talk a little bit about it. So this is kind of a common graphic that is used to kind of describe the difference between equality and equity, right? And the last box really being that, oh, we've taken away the systemic barrier of the fence, right? The fence is gone, and so now everyone can see regardless of the supports that were once provided. The thing that's really interesting is there's actually a movement called the 4th box that is kind of pointing to this idea that, our DEI work doesn't stop here, right? And that even within the context of this graphic that's used to illustrate the main point between equity and equality, there's a lot of problems in utilizing one graphic like this to represent this larger, comprehensive, systemic, societal issue, right? So the fact that it's a baseball game, you know, presents some challenges. This one that you've got here is actually has like you know, shadows of people, as opposed to other graphics that, you know, clearly depict like just one gender. And so it's and then also the larger issue that I've seen brought up around this graphic in particular is that it's equating when we're talking specifically about racist and anti-racist social justice movements, like this is equating racism with a biological thing like height, and it's pretty problematic for a lot of people. So anyway, it is I think it's a graphic that really represents a complex, to get people to understand diversity, or get people to understand equity versus equality. But even embedded within that, when we start to create these models that are meant to be comprehensive, they actually, you know, can sometimes create more challenges too.
All right, thank you, Anne, for sharing your critical perspective. It's certainly valued and appreciated. And you pointed out some wonderful things. This image, and there's many other iterations that have come after this, has evolved over the years for all of the reasons that you just described. One of the differences between this version and one that we've even used in the past is that in the first version, the fence was equal across. And that got right to the point that you made, is that it implies that there's a deficiency or ineptability, if you will, with the person, and that's why they can't see over the fence or engage in the game in this particular example, when really the systemic barrier is the oppressive structure in place that we need to be familiar with. What are the historical and oppressive practices that are ingrained within our systems, our practices, our philosophies, our teaching materials, and so forth, such that some people are excluded from participating? Of course, this is a simplified version of all of the isms that we are familiar with and systemic barriers that exist within our societies. But the distinction here, and you can remove the bar now, are to show the differences that equality differs from equity, right? And that not everyone receives the same resource to overcome a systemic barrier or to receive the resources that are needed to participate. And then with this last image representing justice and when the systemic barrier is removed. There are versions where we see liberation be described and other examples that are different from even the baseball game as a symbol here. But Anne is spot on with, even with this type of imagery, it's important that we do not minimalize or trivialize what's meant behind this graphic and the idea of systemic oppression and marginalization, and being able to familiarize ourselves with what those are in our own programs, because they do exist, particularly in legacy type programs. You know, those oppressive practices are deeply ingrained within the foundation of our programs and practices. So if you hit advance, I believe the bar will remove. There you go. So it just shows you the differences here in this particular example of equality, equity, and justice. But as Anne so eloquently pointed out, I encourage us all to continue to critically reflect on these types of images and make sure we're not minimizing the meaning or purpose behind them. So let's transition into the 4-H thriving model and share some connections between what we've discussed thus far to this point and 4-H thriving. So if you are not familiar with the 4-H thriving model, this is one of the national models that we are using within our programs to better understand what happens when high quality PYD happens for young people. What are the outcomes we can expect to see, and what happens along the way? So we have lots of frameworks and models and leading literature that kind of drives our work and has driven our work in 4-H for years. And this is one attempt at making a comprehensive model to show if you put in these inputs, we can expect these outputs. One of the problems, though, with having a national model is that if you don't do it with an equity mindset or lens, it can still perpetuate the injustices within our programs in society, right? So what we're talking a little bit about for the remainder of our time today is looking at this model, and we can advance to the next slide, through an equity lens. So the model as it stands has I'd say these three major sections, or four. The first is the developmental context. So these are kind of the inputs, if you will. It's nurturing a young person's sparks, their passions, right? What their purpose is. And a key part of that is making sure that we are being intentional in identifying what individual youth sparks are and not using a one-size-fits-all approach to our youth programs. Using culturally responsive curriculum, literature, and pedagogical practices and how we engage with youth is critical. And then on the outer ring there, you'll see the PYD program quality principles. So that's the quality standards of PYD. And we'll dive in a little bit to that. And then on the outer ring is developmental relationships. So those are all the things we pour into our youth and our youth program. In the center, you'll find the thriving trajectory. So that includes the level of engagement. And here you'll see different terms that we'll dive into here along the trajectory of youth thriving, with the expectation that if these things happen, that you'll have these developmental outcomes and long-term outcomes of youth who are academically motivated and successful, socially competent, have high personal standards, contribute to others, connection with others, and have a sense of personal responsibility. Again, if this does not happen with an equity lens, then it can be problematic, right? If we are using a homogeneous mindset and a one-size-fits-all approach to this work and expectation of outcomes with ignoring the societal context, then we may be doing more harm than good. So on the next slide, I refer to a literature review that I worked on with the support of Dr. Mary Arnold, who is the primary author of the 4-H Thriving Model. So this can be found on 4h.org. We also recently published an article through the Journal of Youth Development, talking a little bit about this as well. So I'm going to kind of pull out pieces from this for our discussion today, but then you can always refer back to the literature for those of you who want to explore it more deeply and read a little bit more closely. So let's start with the developmental context. So the 8 critical aspects of quality on the next slide are probably familiar to you in some way. You probably have seen this terminology in one way or another, but it's kind of an expansion, if you will, of what some of you might refer to as the essential elements of PYD. This kind of comes from some of that literature and expounded in different ways. But the 8 critical aspects of quality, as referred to in the 4-H Thriving Model, is having physical and psychological safety, appropriate structure, supportive relationships, opportunities to belong, positive social norms, support for efficacy or mattering, opportunities for skill building, and then the integration of family, school, and community. What we need to be mindful of as youth development providers and professionals who are reaching audiences who may be of marginalized identities or have been provided limited access to resources historically, we need to consider those sociological factors that directly impact one's physical and psychological safety, right? Even in today's time, with the trauma that we all as a world have experienced just because of a pandemic, everyone's mental wellness has been impacted in some way, right, by the experience we just had together. Having to acknowledge that is one important piece, right, of the sociological factors that exist in one's experience. We have to make sure that our programs are culturally relevant, and we have some resources on that for those who are interested in learning a little bit more about some of those practices that are required of us if our programs are to be relevant and co-designed with the youth in which we're engaging. And then the relationships that we have must be with diverse groups of youth and adults, right? Because representation is so important. And if we don't have positive, caring adults who look like and represent and connect with the youth, then there are limitations to those developmental relationships. Having opportunities for genuine and intentional belonging, making sure that youth, volunteers, and adults alike can bring their whole selves to the workplace and feel like they belong there and are fully included in that experience. And then our norms that we have of our program should not reinforce hegemonic understandings of norms or behaviors, right? So this requires us to be familiar with the different cultural practices and norms within our community. and having those norms be shaped together, right? And not from this hegemonic understanding of what good behavior, quote, is. And then support for efficacy and mattering. This will require some opportunities for critical thinking and action. And here's where some social justice work comes into play. That's not the focus of today's conversation, but in order for a young person to feel, right, like they can make a difference and feel empowered and feel like they have the resources needed to bring about change in their own environment, we have to increase their social capital and their ability to develop agency and efficacy. And the types of programs that we do in 4-H certainly help to foster those opportunities. And then again, making sure that our skill-based learning is culturally relevant and that those connections with family, school, and community can help spiral up connections, the who you knows that a person has, because those who you knows are often what brings about change in one's life or progression. Okay, so on the next slide, it focuses on that developmental relationships. And these are the positive and supportive relationships youth and 4-H and volunteers have, and this is critical in youth development. They're called developmental because they grow and change as a young person does. And again, we have to make sure that the relationships that we are fostering within our 4-H experiences represent the diversity of the communities that we're hoping to serve. So the same effort that we're pouring into creating diversity among our youth, we have to match that same energy in developing diverse volunteers, faculty and staff, and youth development providers in our program, because it's all interconnected. So moving on to the next slide goes into the engagement piece. So that's the central part of the thriving model. And it talks about how a young person, what those outcomes look like at the end, in part, are connected to the duration, intensity, and breadth of the 4-H experience or engagement. So some of you who have been within 4-H and other aspects beyond a SIFAR program may be aware that the club model, the 4-H club model, has been kind of lifted as a premier 4-H experience, and that everything else is often referred to as non-traditional or the other, or outreach, as an example. We're trying to move away from that language because it places kind of this historical context that there's one way that 4-H should be and everything else is different, right? When really the model, if used appropriately, moves us away from what the delivery mode, if you will, is, and towards what is put into that experience. The duration, the intensity, the breadth, the quality of the relationships and the experiences. And those things can happen in any 4-H model, whether it's a club, after school, the camping experience, or some new innovative model that we haven't even explored yet. All of those things can happen in any of those experiences. And that's what we are trying to elevate and describe when we shift the narrative of what 4-H is, right? 4-H is a positive youth development program and experience. And we're trying to pour in opportunities for youth to have a long-term experience with a sustainable experience, and increasing the intensity and the breadth of that experience so that the outcomes are richer. But we also know that depending on one's circumstances and other opportunities that they have available to them, or things that they may not have experienced just yet, all of those things can determine what type of length and duration and intensity are needed to really be meaningful in a child's life. So that's some of what the 4-H Thriving Model research team is exploring right now, in fact. So on the next slide, we have the 4-H Thriving indicators. So if you recall back to the image, that's what's in the center. We had the tick marks along the way. And they're saying that some of the indicators to thriving is being open to challenge and discovery. And exposure to new opportunities and connections can serve as a link, right, to critical perspectives, resources, and connections to institutions that can bring about change. When I talk about social capital, I kind of referred earlier to it as the who you knows, right? The networks and relationships that a young person has, and being exposed to new things, new places, new possibilities. These things all help develop a young person's agency or efficacy. That's the belief that they can make a difference, that they can achieve the goals that they have for themselves. and that they can dream big and that someone is there to support their dream, right? And then with a growth mindset, this directly connects to the concept of high expectations. One of the things we have to be mindful of in this work is not making assumptions that people of color, as an example, or in the non-dominant identity groups, lack assets, right? We too often associate marginalization with poverty or limited access to resources or limited educational capability, right? We have to be sure not to overgeneralize and fall into those stereotypes. While certainly there's a disproportionate amount of people of color, as an example, who are living in poverty because of the historical oppressions that have happened over time, but we can't discount all of the cultural and social and other community forms of capital and assets that exist within communities and harness those types of things. So that brings us back to this notion of high expectations. We need to have high expectations of young people so long as the expectations that we have are grounded in relevance to that community that we're engaging with. Hopeful purpose is another thriving indicator listed there, and that concept directly connects to self-efficacy, which I mentioned is an integral part to a young person's confidence and success, particularly as it relates to issues of injustice. Transcendent awareness is one that sometimes trips people up because some folks associate it with religious practice or spirituality, and that certainly could be one of the ways that you look at it. I tend to look at transcendent awareness as this notion that the world is bigger than you and I, right? That we have a responsibility to the world around us, and that, back to Dr. King's quote, injustice anywhere around us should matter to all of us. So that's kind of this notion of giving back to others, caring about the world around you. And then pro-social orientation, it must include diverse cultural values and norms, as I mentioned earlier. Same with positive emotionality and understanding how one's societal trauma, right, can impact factors related to optimism and emotional responses. And then the final one there, goal management. Youth cultural values must be at the center, though, of establishing what desired goals are for a program. We can't dictate what success in 4-H, right, or academically looks like. Those should be driven by the youth that we engage with as well. All right, we can move on to the next slide. Developmental outcomes is the last piece of the thriving model. And we have academic motivation, success, reduction in risk behaviors, healthful choices, societal competence, personal standards, and then I mentioned connection and contribution to others. Here again, on the right, you'll see the considerations with equity in mind, right? We have to consider how inequitable access to quality education can impact motivation and ability to achieve academically. Some of you might be familiar with the term or phrase academic or achievement gap rather. Gloria Ladson-Billings urges us to move away from that language and towards an education debt that is owed to students who have not had access to a high quality and relevant education or education at all, for that matter, just decades ago, right? So being mindful of that and how that shapes a young person's experience and a family's experience with education is important. And then making sure that we consider societal and oppressive factors that increase risk factors. That we talk about reduction of risk behaviors, we have to recognize that there have been systemic factors in play that increase risk factors for young people. That doesn't mean that, you know, we've moved away from the term at-risk youth, even though SIFAR still has it in the acronym, because all children face some risk, right? But youth out of marginalized or non-dominant identities groups have increased societal risk factors that are at play. And it's not an individual, right, necessarily risk factor, it's societal risk factors that are at play because of their limited access to resources that are needed to thrive. And then you have some other examples here that I've kind of referenced throughout our discussion today. So I encourage, as you think about the thriving model and your work in the 4-H space, that you take some time to reflect on these equity considerations as it relates to our work in 4-H and the 4-H thriving model. So on the next slide, we share some of what's coming next. Our Access, Equity, and Belonging Committee has put together fact sheets for each of those audiences that I mentioned earlier to take a deeper dive. So today I kind of talked about the theory and some of the research behind the thriving through an equity lens. And what's coming next is a practical fact sheet for each of the audiences. What does this all mean when we get down to working with youth and volunteers, right? So we have fact sheets that are coming out focusing on belonging, the social conditions of the particular audience being discussed on the fact sheet, competencies that are so critically important for our professionals and our volunteers, community relationships and partners to consider, and then additional resources, as well as some considerations for how we evaluate our programs with the limitations that might be faced to resources or literacy levels and those types of things for our different audiences. So that should be coming out really soon. It's under review right now, and we're really excited to get that out to you all so that it can serve as an additional resource for us as we engage in programs in community. So on the next slide, I pull from the Social Justice Youth Development Guide that was released a few years ago. And they are self-reflection questions that we can ask of ourselves as we reflect on the fences in our programs, right? As we reflect on what are those systemic level and historical barriers that we have in place in our programs and in the broader society so that we can begin to be responsive or continue to be responsive to those. So on the next slide, I pulled out 3 questions, and I would love to hear some other voices at this time that we can focus on. And there are other questions listed there, but these 3 I thought were most appropriate for our conversation today. But through what processes are you recognizing, identifying, and reacting to learning environments that are predominantly and historically filled with dominant cultures? And I see we didn't catch the typo there, so I apologize for that. But that first question is that are predominantly and historically filled with dominant cultures. And then on the second question, how do you invite, welcome, engage, and recognize the achievements of diverse youth? And are there barriers to engagement and recognition in your program? And then the third, have you created opportunities where youth and the community are intentionally involved in program planning and evaluation? So if we were together in person, like we would have been when we originally were thinking about putting this on, we would have had some time to break up and have some discussion around these. But instead, I would love, since we can unmute, if there was a few of you willing to unmute and respond to one of these questions. As we think critically about our own programs, as it relates to equity and justice, and kind of our leading models that we are integrating within our programs, how would you respond to any one of these questions? And to our room host, if I were to stop sharing for a second, would we see all of the faces in the room? Okay, so we can do that. All right, so that will help, I think, with some of our discussion. I'm going to change my view to gallery view because I much prefer to see faces as we speak. So I can certainly pull up the questions again, but Joe, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, so this wasn't through work, but there was a partnership between an organization I'm a part of and a local neighborhood center. And what we did was we found within our organization somebody who was a law student and somebody who was a police officer, as well as somebody who was a staff of a nonprofit organization. And we were all informal, but we went to the law school and, essentially went through some, really kind of in-depth questions about law, about, historical violence against communities of color, and just, worked with the young people there to just dig through those issues and questions. And it was just a really rich dialogue because you did have some people with content knowledge and content expertise, but you also had a really just frank and open conversation about racism in America and about the actual mechanics of it and how it impacts your day-to-day life. So it was probably one of the best discussions I've ever been a part of with young people. And I'm thinking like more opportunities like that where you just ask open-ended questions and like just move through really like analyzing the world around you.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe, for sharing that. And it's a nice reminder, you know, sometimes folks might feel like 4-H is not the space for that. 4-H is absolutely the space for that. We can't engage youth without acknowledgement of who they are, right? And if we are not acknowledging, particularly with SIFAR related projects where that's the intention of the program, if we're not acknowledging racism as an example, then we are allowing it to perpetuate within our programs, because we are then not allowing ourselves to recognize how it's permeated even into our own programs and how it's impacting each and every one of us in different ways. So I'm glad to hear more and more 4-H programs are making the space to either partner with organizations or host themselves these important conversations that are so critical to this work. Thank you for sharing. I see in the chat, Renee shared in leadership roles, one example with our 4-H association, a board of 25 people, only one person of color. Renee, are you willing to unmute and dive a little deeper into your thoughts there and what that means for us as an association?
Well, I just think it's another example of, you know, we have to keep working at not just talking at the issue, but addressing it. You know, the questions have disappeared, but like when we hear the phrase systemic, if something is systemic, okay, that means it's with the system. So, you know, older white men in big chairs on board of directors. I mean, you know, that's systemic. We see changes in some areas, but, you know, I was in a meeting similar to this back a few months ago with, you know, how does it affect us directly as an organization? And a gentleman was on the call and stated this. You know, I wasn't aware of it until he brought attention to it, that he, as an Asian, is the only person, you know, of color. So, you know, it's going to take a while, but how long?
Right. Yeah, and it gets back to the idea of equality versus equity, because too often when we realize that something like that is still persistent within our programs, we might do, you know, to simplify the example here, an email blast to encourage folks to apply or to nominate themselves to be on the board, when it takes much more than that, right? There are reasons why some people have been excluded from these opportunities, and it will take more than an email blast to get them engaged and to feel like they belong there, and it's not filling in a void that has been vacant for so long. So I encourage us to be thinking about what are the steps we're taking to equitably change the circumstances. And it will mean shuffling funds differently, making policy decisions that allow us to better intentionally engage those voices who have been excluded from conversations and decision-making. And it may mean that some voices might need to be silenced some, right? If their voices have been elevated for 100 years, we might need to shift where the microphone is so that we can move towards equitable practices and taking down some of those barriers that have been in place for generations. And if we're able to pull up the slide, thank you for sharing the questions in the chat. Before we run out of time, if you can go to the next slide, I did want to point one resource that's coming out, and then we can pause for questions that might exist. But I am excited. So the reflection questions that I included can be found in the resource on the left, and you can find that on 4h.org or on our Access, Equity, and Belonging website. And I encourage you with your organizations and your program partners to engage a little bit more deeply in some of those reflection questions. We also have some for youth that can be asked of youth to reflect on our facilitation and our programs through that social justice lens. On the right, though, is a curriculum that will be coming out really soon. It's in the process of being added to the Shop 4-H site. And if you go on the next slide, you can get a snapshot of what you'll find in this new curriculum. So it's called True Leaders, Culture, Power, and Justice, And there are 5 sections, one focusing on introduction and context, the other on cultural identity. It moves into acknowledging and appreciating other cultures, then to building networks and agency, and it closes with power and social justice. And we are so excited. It's geared towards middle and high school students, and it will be available really soon. They're working on getting it added to the Shop 4-H website now. And this is a great curriculum to walk you through a social justice program, from self-reflection all the way to advocacy and justice-centered program. So I would love to dive more deeply into this, but I know we had a short time to gather today. So I'll just pause now and I'll see if there's any questions or comments on anything that I tried to squeeze into this short time that we had this afternoon. And Faye, if you wanted to unmute and add anything, please join.
It's all good. Thank you, Nia.
Have any questions, comments?
Yeah, I have one. So, and Nia, you can answer or anybody can weigh in, but I'm just thinking about going from sort of policy best practice to action, particularly at a statewide level, when there are, different politics around, racial justice and change, particularly when, I don't know how it works in other states, but at least here, much of the funding as well as the support comes from local counties and communities and local sort of elected bodies, which often can put up, immense barriers and resistance to that change. Any feedback on that would be appreciated.
Sure. So that's a whole hour conversation, right? So what I will share in this short amount of time, and then I encourage you to reach out to me if you would like to chat further. I serve as this program leader for Maryland 4-H. So in my role, I have the ability to directly impact and shape policy, procedure, direction of our program, right? So it is critical that you have leadership in your state that's on board and putting the action behind the words that we have placed on most of our websites, as far as our philosophy being open to all, right? It's holding ourselves accountable to what we say we believe in. But one of the things that we all are working on, because your point is spot on, is that because we are federally, state, and locally funded, we are often held to the priorities of folks who are in power and in our elected positions in our states and local communities. So ECOP 4-H is working on a strategic plan. And one of the components of that is the importance of diversifying funding streams and national community partners. Because in order for us to really provide programs beyond what we're doing now, we have to have the financial support and not be held to one group who might not be willing to move in that direction. So that's some of the things, and I know my time is up, so I can't go too much deeper, but do know that it's in conversations with extension leaders, directors, program directors across the country. And I am confident that some great work will be coming in the coming years around that.
What was the name of that plan that you said is coming out?
It's the ECOP 4-H Equity Strategic Plan. And if you reach out to your extension director, they should be able to point you in the right direction to access it. And Faye, if she's quick enough, she might be able to find it online and put the link. But if not, you can reach out to your extension administrator.
And Jill, and you can reach out to your program leader, because all program leaders have a copy of it.
So I'm out of time. That went by so quickly. So I'll turn it back over to you, Phil.
So I just want to say thank you to Nia and Faye for the presentation and your words of wisdom. It is absolutely critical that we do take things with the equity lens, and that we are not just going blind down the river, so to speak. Again, thank you for not just today's presentation, but the work that you all do in your respective jobs, but then also with the Access, Equity, and Belonging Committee. If you don't know about it, please check it out and see the work that they're doing to help 4-H as a whole to move forward. So that brings us to time. Again, please take a 15-minute break to stretch your legs, stretch your eyes, get away from the computer screen. And then when we come back in about 15 minutes, breakout room number 1, we'll have Dr. Benita Williams, and she'll be having a feedback session. Breakout room number 2 will be connecting during the pandemic. And breakout room 3 will be a SciFar coaches panel where you can talk to coaches about different things. So pending any questions, that's all we have for this